My name is Jasmine, this is Understanding Urbanism. In celebration of Black History Month, I wanted to do an episode to honor and inform on the contributions of Black Americans to urban planning. The urban planning ideas we credit to the wrong people. Before urban planners wrote the rules for American cities, Black communities were already solving the problems. Walkable streets, shared public space, built-in safety, those ideas didn't vanish. They were taken after the neighborhoods that created them were erased. And once you see it, you can't see American cities the same way again. Because some of the most celebrated urban planning ideas in America didn't come from planners. They came from communities that were later destroyed. Why this matters to you? In the United States, urban planning is often described as a neutral technical process. Maps, models, traffic counts, all of it suggests objectivity and expertise. But cities don't just happen on paper. They're lived in, walked through, fought over, and many of the ideas we now celebrate as good urbanism, walkable neighborhoods, mixed-use streets, eyes on the street, community oversight, were not first invented in planning schools or city halls. They were lived, tested, and refined in Black neighborhoods. And here's the part we don't talk about enough. Many of those same neighborhoods were later labeled blighted, obsolete, or unsafe, and then erased through urban renewal, highway construction, and zoning. So we have to ask, what if Black Americans weren't just affected by urban planning? What if they were some of its most important designers, even if they were never credited as such? Because urban planning isn't just a discipline. It's about land, power, and whose lives are considered worth protecting. And it shapes how long your commute is, whether your rent rises, and whether your community gets to stay at all. Built before planners existed. Long before urban planning existed as a profession, Black Americans were designing communities. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people built freedmen's towns, self-governed settlements, and autonomous neighborhoods, often on marginal land without formal infrastructure, under constant threat of violence and displacement. And yet, these places were not accidental. They were organized. Spatial decisions shaped everyday life. A child could walk from home to school without crossing a major road. Churches were placed within minutes of homes, functioning as civic hubs, shelters, informal courts. Corner stores extended credit, not because of systems, but because owners lived above and knew their neighbors' workdays. Homes faced the street. Porches created eyes on public space. Density made it possible to share childcare, food, information, and safety. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were spatial strategies for safety, care, and survival. Weeksville in Brooklyn, Nicodemus in Kansas, Eatonville in Florida functioned as complete urban systems. This was planning without permits, without capital, without state protection. Planning shaped by constraint and refined through daily life. And here's the part that matters. Many of these neighborhoods were working better than the ones that replaced them. How success became blight. By the early 20th century, Black neighborhoods across the country had become centers of economic life. Tulsa's Greenwood district, often called Black Wall Street, was one of the most successful examples. Greenwood was intentionally urban. Banks, insurance companies, law offices, hotels, theaters, newspapers, hospitals, dense mixed-use blocks, a walkable street grid, connections to rail and nearby oil wealth. Because Black residents were excluded from white Tulsa, wealth circulated internally. Land ownership stayed local. Profits stayed in the community. By every metric planners use today, density, ownership, circulation, Greenwood was a success. Greenwood didn't fail, it was attacked. The Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921 was a false accusation against a Black teenager which triggered a white mob attack. Over 24 hours, 30+ blocks were burned, hundreds killed, thousands left homeless, survivors were detained, rebuilding was restricted, not supported. From a planning lens, Greenwood wasn't just destroyed, it was erased as a functioning urban ecosystem. Harlem followed a different path, but the same logic. Dense housing, street-level commerce, vibrant public life. Yet it was labeled overcrowded, dangerous, diseased, justifying disinvestment and urban renewal. Blight didn't describe physical decay. It described neighborhoods that were politically inconvenient and economically valuable to someone else. This wasn't an exception. It was a template. And once cities learned they could remove Black neighborhoods and call it planning, they kept doing it. When ideas lost their authors. Urban planning textbooks often centered Jane Jacobs as the voice of community-based urbanism, but many of the practices she described, like eyes on the street, mixed-use blocks, short trips, and informal social control, were already present in Black neighborhoods. They weren't theories, they were necessities. And when these ideas entered academia and policy, Black authorship was rarely acknowledged. The neighborhoods that produced them were rarely preserved. These ideas weren't discovered. They were observed after the land was lost. Despite systemic exclusion, Black professionals entered architecture and planning and reshaped cities anyways. Paul R. Williams designed over 2,000 buildings across Los Angeles: housing, civic structure, transit-adjacent development. He learned to draw upside down so white clients wouldn't have to sit next to him. Cities also need systems, not just buildings. Enter Garrett Morgan, an inventor in Cleveland. In 1923, after seeing a carriage accident, Morgan noticed a flaw in early traffic signals. Stop-and-go lights created confusion and danger. His three-position signal added a warning phase, giving people time to anticipate change. It treated streets as shared space designed for real human behavior. General Electric bought the patent for $40,000. Today, the three-light signal is everywhere, but almost never credited to the man who made it possible. Decades before Jane Jacobs wrote about sidewalk trust, Morgan translated similar insights into infrastructure. Different tools, same truth. Highways, the new frontier of removal. By the mid-20th century, cities had a new tool. Not fire, not mobs, concrete. Federal highway funding arrived with urgency, speed, and enormous budgets. And when routes had to be chosen, they were rarely drawn through neighborhoods with the most political power. They were drawn through neighborhoods with the least. Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans, Rondo in St. Paul, Paradise Valley in Detroit, Bronzeville in multiple cities, Overtown in Miami. Thriving Black corridors of Black commerce and culture were split in half. Oak-lined boulevards became overpasses, main streets became on-ramps, homes were seized through eminent domain. Businesses were demolished. Generational wealth was wiped out in a single construction session. And here's what's important. Highways weren't just transportation projects. They were spatial dividers. They created physical barriers that isolated neighborhoods from town job centers, from waterfronts, and from investment. They depressed property values on one side while increasing them on the other. They concentrated noise, pollution, and health risk in communities already facing disinvestment. This wasn't random. Route selection involved hearing, maps, votes, technical memos. It looked procedural, it looked rational, but again, neutral language can hide unequal outcomes. A highway can be described as regional mobility, but for the family whose house sits where the interchange now stands, it's removal. In Austin, Interstate 35 was routed along the city's historic racial dividing line, separating East Austin, where Black residents were pushed by policy and practice, from wealthier white neighborhoods to the west. The highway didn't create segregation, but it hardened it in concrete, and that pattern repeats across the country. Transportation infrastructure became a way to formalize existing racial boundaries, to make temporary segregation feel permanent, to turn political exclusion into physical distance. And the economic impact was enormous. When you demolish a business corridor, you don't just remove storefronts, you remove local hiring networks, informal credit systems, community gathering spaces, tax bases. You remove circulation. You interrupt the internal economy that made neighborhoods resilient. And when highways made suburban commutes easier, investment followed the road. White flight accelerated, urban tax bases shrank, disinvestment intensified. The neighborhoods that had already survived redlining and urban renewal were now cut off from the rest of the city. This wasn't a single decision, it was a sequence. Label a neighborhood blighted, withhold investment, route a highway through it, call the outcome inevitable. And if your commute feels unavoidable today, if public transit feels underfunded, if walkability feels out of reach, if you live in a neighborhood bisected by concrete, this history explains why. But the story doesn't end with removal. Black residents resisted. They organized, filed lawsuits, stalled projects, forced reroutes, demanded mitigation. In some cities, they saved a portion of their neighborhoods. In others, they preserved memory when preservation wasn't possible. They were planning even when official plans excluded them. And this is where the conversation shifts, because once highways made inequality visible, the argument that planning was neutral became harder to sustain. Black women and urban care. Black women were central to urban survival, not as a footnote, not as assistants, not just as community voices invited after decisions were made. They were planners in practice, even when they weren't called planners. They organized housing access, improved schools, negotiated with landlords, built childcare networks, advocated for safer transit, fought environmental hazards. They did the work that kept neighborhoods alive when institutions withdrew. Fannie Lou Hamer built cooperative land ownership through the Freedom Farm Cooperative because she understood that political rights without land security were fragile. Majora Carter linked environmental repair to economic opportunity, arguing that clean air and access to green space should not require displacement. Contemporarily, figures like Hamer and Carter are finally receiving more recognition, but many others have been lost in time. Women who organized rent strikes in northern cities when exploitative landlords refused repairs, women who created block associations to keep streets safe when policing was absent or hostile, women who ran informal transit carpools so neighbors could reach jobs segregated by distance, women who mapped toxic dumping sites long before environmental justice was a formal framework. Their names rarely appear in planning textbooks. Their strategies rarely appear in zoning codes, but their work shaped how neighborhoods functioned. And here's what's important. While formal planning institutions prioritize growth, efficiency, and property values, Black women prioritized care, stability, and survival. They planned for who was vulnerable, for who might be displaced, for who needed help right now. This wasn't growth-first planning, it was care-first planning. And in many ways, it was more realistic about how cities actually work. Because cities are not just infrastructure systems, they're support systems. And long before urban policy adopted words like resilience and community engagement, Black women were already building both. But as their strategies entered policy language, their names often did not. Recognition is growing, but recognition is not the same as restoration. And that distinction matters, because the story of urban planning is not just about who was excluded. It's also about whose labor made the city possible, even when history looked the other way. And this is where the myth of neutrality starts to crack. The myth of neutral planning. Urban planning has never been neutral. It presents itself as technical, rational, data-driven, but every map is a decision. Every boundary is a value judgment. Every zoning code answers a question: who belongs here and who doesn't? Zoning determines what can be built. Lending determines who can buy. Infrastructure determines who can move. Environmental policy determines who breathes clean air. None of that is neutral, because neutrality would require starting from equal ground, and American cities never did. When planners labeled Black neighborhoods blighted, that wasn't neutral. When highways were routed through communities with the least political power, that wasn't neutral. When redlining maps devalued entire areas based on race, that wasn't neutral. Planning didn't just reflect inequality. It organized it, it stabilized it, it made it look permanent. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Many of these decisions were perfectly legal, approved, stamped, modeled, justified. Neutral language can hide unequal outcomes. A highway alignment can be described as cost efficient while permanently removing generational wealth. A zoning code can be described as preserving neighborhood character while excluding entire groups of people. A redevelopment plan can be described as revitalization while displacing the residents who sustained the area when no one else invested. The language sounds objective, the outcomes rarely are, and Black planners, scholars, and organizers have spent decades challenging this illusion. They developed environmental justice frameworks to show that pollution follows power. They advanced community land trusts to interrupt displacement cycles. They pushed participatory planning models that treat residents as decision makers, not obstacles. They reframed planning as reparative work because if planning helped produce inequality, then planning must also help repair it. And that requires abandoning the myth that planning is neutral. If planning isn't neutral, then neither are the outcomes we live with today. Commute times, heat islands, food deserts, property values, school funding, all shaped by decisions made long ago, and decisions still being made now. So the real question isn't whether planning is political. It always has been. The question is who gets to shape it, and that's where modern Black urbanism steps forward. Modern Black urbanism, the work continues. Today, Black urbanists are not just reacting to planning systems, they're reshaping them. Not through nostalgia, not through symbolism, through structure, because the questions haven't changed. Who benefits from growth? Who absorbs the cost? Who gets to stay? Across the country, Black planners, scholars, architects, organizers, and policy designers are building frameworks that directly respond to the patterns we just traced. Community land trusts remove land from speculative markets so housing can remain affordable across generations. Participatory budgeting gives residents real decision-making power over public funds. Environmental justice mapping reveals how pollution tracks along racial and economic lines, forcing cities to confront what neutral policy created. Transit equity analysis asks who spends the most time commuting and why. These aren't abstract ideals, they're corrections, because modern Black urbanism starts from a premise planning once avoided. Displacement is not an accident. Inequality is not random. Infrastructure is not neutral. And once you accept that, your design priorities change. You plan for permanence. You plan for ownership. You plan for stability. You plan for return, not removal. This is why conversations about reparative planning are growing louder, not as charity, not as apology, as infrastructure strategy, because cities are running into limits. Housing crises, climate disasters, transit inequity, public distrust. The old growth first model is producing instability, and the solutions cities are reaching for now, mixed-use density, walkable blocks, community engagement, local economic circulation, sounds very familiar. They look like the neighborhoods once labeled blighted. They look like the spatial strategies developed under constraint. They look like care-first planning. The difference now is recognition, and even that is incomplete. Because while more Black urbanists are gaining visibility today, many are still doing this work in rooms where their expertise is questioned, their authority minimized, or their labor extracted without credit. Modern Black urbanism is not a trend, it's a continuation. A through line from Freedmen's towns to environmental justice coalitions, from porch-based surveillance to participatory design, from cooperative land ownership to anti-displacement zoning reform. And here's what makes this moment different. For the first time in a long time, cities are being forced to admit that technical solutions alone don't solve structural harm. They're being pushed to confront history, to reconsider who they call expert, to recognize that some of the most durable urban strategies did not come from institutions, but from communities that had to survive without them. And if that recognition deepens, if it turns into policy, funding, land return, structural repair, then modern Black urbanism won't just influence planning. It will redefine it, and that's what makes this story unfinished. What this changes. Black Americans didn't just live in cities. They built them, organized them, stabilized them, defended them, reimagined them. They developed spatial strategies for safety when safety wasn't guaranteed. They built mixed-use corridors when access was restricted. They created informal social infrastructure when formal institutions withdrew. And when their neighborhoods worked, when they were walkable, cohesive, economically circulating, socially resilient, they were often targeted instead of protected, labeled blighted, bisected by highways, cleared for redevelopment, absorbed into policy without credit. That's not coincidence. That's extraction, not just of labor, not just of land, of ideas, of systems, of knowledge about how cities function under pressure. And the cost of that erasure is not just historical. It shows up today in displacement that feels constant, in housing markets that feel untouchable, in commutes that feel permanent, in neighborhoods that flood while others stay dry, in public meetings where decisions feel predetermined. When cities search for innovative solutions to affordability, to safety, to community trust, they are often rediscovering principles that were already practiced. Walkability, density with social cohesion, local economic circulation, community governance, care-based infrastructure. The ideas were never missing. The credit was. And that matters, because when we misidentify where knowledge comes from, we misidentify who should be leading the future of cities. If we treat Black neighborhoods only as sites of damage, we miss that they were also sites of design. If we study only formal planning documents, we miss the planning that happened on porches, in church basements, in tenant meetings, in cooperative farms, in block associations. Urban planning did not begin with zoning codes. It began where people had to survive. And once you see that, maps look different, highways look different, redevelopment proposals look different, because you start asking different questions. Not just, what is being built, but who benefits? Who decides? Who's displaced? Whose ideas are being repackaged? Whose neighborhood is being described as underutilized? And maybe the most important question, who had this figured out before the institutions arrived? Black history is urban history, not as a metaphor, as infrastructure, as land use, as transportation, as housing policy, as environmental justice. And if we want better cities, more equitable cities, more stable cities, more human cities, we can not only study policy, we have to study power, we have to study memory, we have to study whose knowledge was absorbed, whose neighborhoods were erased, and who is still paying for decisions that were never neutral. Because planning has always shaped who gets to stay. The question now is whether we are willing to reshape planning with full honesty about its past. And that conversation is not finished. It's just becoming unavoidable. If this episode changed how you think about cities, drop a comment. What part of your city suddenly makes more sense after watching this? Send it to someone who thinks planning is neutral. Cities make more sense when you stop asking only what was built and start asking who had to fight for it. If this episode changed how you think about cities, drop a comment. What part of your city suddenly makes more sense after watching this? Send it to someone who thinks planning is neutral. Cities make more sense when you stop asking only what was built and start asking who had to fight for it. My name is Jasmine. This is Understanding Urbanism. See you next time.